Hi everybody, in this video we're going to look at blending with your watercolours, taking you through how you can blend the same colour to create that transition from light to dark, and also how you would blend multiple colours together. So let's jump in. So we're going to start with some very simple shapes. I'm just going to sketch down 2 circles in pencil. And I'm going to show you 2 different techniques of blending one colour. That's not a very good circle. Okay. So the first one we're going to do, I'm going to do wet in wet. And that means I'm going to take clean water and just make sure the whole of this circle is covered in water. Now when you're doing this, I want you to make sure you smooth the water out so you don't have any big puddles getting in the way, causing chaos. So we want a nice smooth glossy sheen to the paper. So if I hold this up, let's see if we can catch the light. I had it then. Where's the light? There's the light. So you can see the shine on the paper. Now I'm just going to take my yellow, this is Hansa yellow, pop that in here with some water. Now the aim is to have the paint of the similar consistency or wetness to my circle. So load up that brush and I'm simply going to paint and spread that paint out over the entire circle. And you'll see, because we've wet the paper first, we've got plenty of time to play around. We're not in any hurry. That paint's not going to dry on us too quickly. So I want a nice even wash in our circle. There we go. Now what I'm going to do, whilst this is still wet, I'm going to take some more of my yellow into my puddle to make it a wee bit stronger. And so that it shows up on camera better, I'm going to add a little bit of my quinacridone magenta to make a slightly more orange yellow. And then I'm going to imagine that we've got the sunshine coming from this direction. I'm using my right hand here. So we want some shadow around the base. So this time I'm not brushing, I'm tapping. I'm just loading up my brush and tapping with the tip of the hairs around the dark side. Here we go. Tap that in. And what's going to happen is this darker yellow is going to soften and blend in all by itself with the colour that we painted underneath. Wet in wet. So wet in wet paper, we've applied our first layer of yellow and now we've applied a second layer of that yellow, giving us that shadow underneath. And you can continue, whilst those paints are wet, you can continue to strengthen the shadow. You could take it darker still if you wish. So let's do that. I'm going to take some more quinacridone magenta, make this orange a bit stronger, and I'm going to do exactly the same thing. I'm just going to tap around that bottom edge and then dance my brush in that orb, and you'll see your colour will bleed out into that colour, into the colours underneath. And just watch it dry, watch that move. Now if you wanted to and you'd painted a little bit too much on there, let's do that. Let's paint a bit too far. So I've gone too far with my shadow up the orb. So in that case, what I'll do is I'll clean my brush, dab it on the tissue. Where's my tissue? Or a towel. Get rid of the excess water, and then really gently, I'm going to come in, really gently, take my damp brush in and pick some of that colour up, and you can move it around, but really gently. And don't have your brush too dry. If your brush is too dry, it will soak up all of the colour. Okay, so that's our wet in wet technique. It's a lovely technique, and I will share a link to a class on some lovely little sparrows that I painted a couple of years ago, that if you want to explore this further, you can follow that link and go across and watch the real-time video on the sparrows. So we're going to wait for that to dry. Whilst we're waiting for that to dry, we're going to do a second one, but this time we're going to paint our yellow onto dry paper. So I'm going to do the same thing again. Start with my hands of yellow and a puddle of water. And we're going to paint half. We're going to come round. We're going to paint the lighter half. Now both of these techniques work, but one gives you more time than the other one to work with. So I'm going to go back and add some yellow into my orange here. So we go back to stage one, and then I'm going to paint this orangey yellow around the lower half. You want the consistency of both colours to be similar, and then we're just going to touch in to the yellow. Now you will naturally get some bleeding like we did here, but it's going to be a slower process because we don't have as much water on the paper. So to hurry this up a little bit and to get more softening, I'm just going to take a damp brush, clean your brush, tap it on your tissue so there's not too much water, and I'm just going to wiggle my brush along that line where the two colours meet and nudge that colour around to encourage the blending. There we go. A similar result. If you want to, you can come in again. Let's take some more quinacridone magenta, make that darker orange. I'm going to come in again and just doing what I did the first time, just dabbing down with the tip of my brush. I'm taking some stronger pigment over the top. This again will start to blend in with the colour underneath. You can see my first orb is still shiny, is still wet. You see the gloss on there? This one's going to dry a lot quicker because we didn't pre-wet the paper. So I'm going to need to fiddle with it a little bit more with my damp brush just to get that even, natural looking shadow side to my orb. So personally, I prefer the wet on wet version. It gives you a much nicer, more natural transition from the darker side to the light. What we can also do with these is lift out a highlight. So when the paint starts drying back and you see the shine start to disappear, you can come in with your clean brush, get rid of the excess water, and we can lift out a highlight. Just lift out a highlight. A bit more clean water on that one. And we can lift some of the paint back off. You want to do it whilst the paper's still slightly damp so that you get that softening again around the highlight. If you lift off paint once it's completely dry, you'll get a very crisp line. And in this exercise, we're all about keeping everything smooth and soft. So lift out whilst it's damp. And what will happen is some of that pigment will creep back in and give you this soft illusion. So let's have a look at mixing some very different colours. I'm going to stick with the circle. Let's come over this side. And this time I'm going to have some fun with some red. So I'm going to mix some red. I use my primary colours in all my tutorials. That's phthalo blue, quinacridone magenta and Hansa yellow. And from those three colours you can mix a whole spectrum of colours that you see in nature. Follow the link above if you want to learn more about my primary colours. Okay. So I'm going to add my pink, my magenta into the yellow, and that is going to turn red. Now a lot of people think red is a primary colour, but it isn't, because you can mix it. Okay, so I'm just going to mix my colours first. I want a little bit more strength in that, so make it a bit creamier, a bit more pink in there, and a touch more yellow. So there's my red, and then I'm going to use some burnt sienna, which is another colour I use a lot. You can mix this, as you'll see if you go to the colour mixing tutorial, but I'm just going to have some burnt sienna. It's a colour, one of the added colours that I use often in my tutorials. Okay, here we go. So we are going to wet the ball first, the orb. Clean water. Remember, you don't want any big puddles sitting on the surface, so make sure it's evenly coated, and then just take a damp brush over the top to make sure it's nice and even. And remember to hold it up to the light to check you've got that nice shine going on. Okay, I'm going to start with my red. I'm kind of in my head imagining this is a little robin redbreast. And in we go with our red on one side. I'm going to have some fun with this. Let's add a little bit of yellow as well. A little bit of yellow at the top. And I'm going to run that into the red. So we're going to get a spectrum of colours going from red to orange to yellow. And then I'm going to take my burnt sienna on the other side. I'm going to bring this together until it touches into the red. I just want to tidy up the bottom of my sphere here. There we go. So those colours are just going to melt together to give you this wonderful mixture of colours within the item that you're painting. As I say, there's a sparrow tutorial that you can go and have a look at, and how I use this technique in real life. And of course, whilst the paint is still wet, you can continue to add darker colours in. So just like we did on the first two spheres, I'm just going to dot in wet into wet, some stronger red over on the bottom edge, and you'll see it magically bleeding in to the colours around it. I'm going to do the same with my burnt sienna. I'm going to take that stronger around the edge, so I'm just going to dot in and watch those colours melt and blend together. If I want this colour to soften more and lift some of that colour up and move some of the colour about, I will take my damp brush. Please do not use a really wet brush, because what will happen, you'll get a bloom. The water as it lands will push all the colours apart. So to avoid that happening, touch your clean brush on your tissue first, and then I'm just going to pick up a little bit of that colour from the top right hand side and move it around, nudge it and jiggle it over where I want that to come. And you've got all the time, that luxury of time, working wet onto wet to move that colour around. You can see on the bottom side the red is already doing that on its own, but if you want to encourage it, again, clean your brush, touch it on your tissue first so it's not too wet, avoiding the blooms, and just work within that wet and wet area. Magic. Okay, now I do want to show you what happens if you have too much water on your brush. So I'm going to do it on purpose. I'm going to take a loaded brush and I'm going to drop some water on it. In fact, I'm going to flick some water on the page. Just tap my brush and watch what happens. These are blooms, and sometimes this is a fantastic technique, and we'll come on to it another day, where you can create that look of texture. So just dropping that water on the surface, you can see the white of the paper coming through and the paint's being pushed apart. The water is pushing the paint to the edges. If that happens to you, what you can do, if everything's still wet, is just try and cover that back up again by moving your pigments around. And this is why I'm telling you to tap your brush on your tissue before you go into this stage, unless of course you want texture and you're using that technique on purpose. So we can kind of fix what's gone wrong there. There we go. So let's have a look at a real object. What shall we paint? Let's do a rosy apple. So just going to draw an apple shape down the bottom here. Take it nice and big. There we go. We've got our big apple. I'm going to do a green and red apple. Let me just soak up and clean my palette a second. And we'll go in and mix our green. So starting with my yellow into a puddle. And then to make green, we add some blue. I want this to be like a Granny Smith apple, a nice juicy citrusy apple. So I've gone for a very bright green. It also helps for the camera for you to see. You can of course neutralize that green and make it more earthy, and what you would do to do that is to take the third of your primary colors. So this is a secondary color mixing yellow and blue. If we want that to look more natural, we would take a tiny bit of the third primary color and add that in, and that will dull it down. It will neutralize the color. I want my color a little bit stronger than this, so I'm just going to mix a little bit more and then we'll get started on our apple. I have my red mixed already. Touch more yellow. Fabulous. So we're going to work wet into wet, which is my preferred technique. And we're going to wet the entire surface of our apple. Use the point of your brush as you go around the edge. Do remember guys that when you're painting with watercolour, it's a really obedient medium, and watercolour just loves seeking out water. So if you go outside of the edge with any water, the paint is going to follow. Very obedient. It seeks out water. And now what am I doing? I'm just going to get rid of the excess water on my brush, hold it up to the light to see that shine, and look for any telltale puddles. There's one there, so I'm just going to smooth that out. And now we're ready to go in with our colour. I'm going to take this luscious green and I'm going to paint it nice and freely all over my apple. And what should happen at this stage, because we're brushing the paint around, you should get a nice even wash on the surface of the apple. But one thing that does happen with watercolours that not many people mention is as you come to the end of that brush stroke and you stop, you get this little puddle appear, which on an apple surface I'm happy with, but sometimes you may just want to touch in with your brush, clean your brush, just touch in and soak that up so you don't get a blemish on the surface. I'm going to take my colours a bit stronger because the studio lights are quite bright. I don't think this is showing up so well, so I'm going to go and add a bit more yellow in there. Bit creamier with my paint consistency, and I'm going to go again. That's better. Now you can see. Spreading that paint out nice and evenly all over the surface of our apple. And at this stage it really doesn't matter what direction your brush marks are going, because we're working wet onto wet. Everything's going to soften in. There's my little bubble. Just going to soak that up with a damp brush. Okay, let's go in with some red. So I'm going to have a nice blush on my apple. I'm just going to touch this in to the green. Just mix up a little bit more red quickly. In we go. Touch in with the tip of my brush so I get a nice strong colour. We're creating little puddles, tiny little puddles of red on the surface of the apple. I'm just going to nudge that around a little bit to fade it off into the green. You can see here, if you look really closely, where the paint is spreading out into the water, into the green of the apple. And again, this side I'm just going to encourage that to happen really lightly, tickling the surface where the red's meeting the green over here on the left hand side. We get our lovely rosy apple. And I think this apple needs a touch more yellow. So I'm going to go in, having fun here, knowing I've got all the time in the world to work. I'm just going to drop a bit more yellow in on the right hand side. And because we're working wet into wet, it's all going to bleed together beautifully. In fact, I've just had a great idea. I'm going to put some more yellow near the red. Now be careful with red and green, because you can end up with a brown, because we're now playing with all three primary colours. So you don't want your green too dark. And take a bit more red and just tapping it onto the surface of the apple, and just let watercolour do what it does best. Just fading that out. Clean my brush, dab it on my tissue, and I'm just nudging this red so it disappears into the green. I'm going to take a touch more red on the left hand side. Sometimes I struggle with what's my left and right. I'm going to bring that red right up to the edge of the apple at the bottom, and I want that colour a bit stronger here, so I'm going to dot in again some of those little strong puddles. Everything's still damp, so the paint's going to bleed and it's going to soften together. Take it right to the edge of my apple. It's making me hungry. There. I'm just going to tidy up that bottom edge. I've gone over the line. Perfectionist always. There we have our lovely Granny Smith. It's not a Granny Smith anymore because I've added red. It's a Brambles, maybe. A Brambles apple? Could be. Now do remember you can also lift out. So if there's an area you're not happy with, just clean your brush, damp brush, and you can scoop some of the paint out, wipe it directly on your tissue. Just encouraging that red over into the green on the left hand side. Here I go again, not sure of my left and right. Again, just come in and reshaping that bottom of the apple. And you can see how blending is such a beautiful thing to do with watercolour, how the colours just work together, and wet in wet really is a good option for you. We're going to wait for that to dry, and then we're just going to play around and add some shadows. Okay, the top ones are dry now, so let's just ground these. Oops. So the top ones are dry now, so we're just going to ground them with a little bit of a shadow. And I like to work with opposite colours on the colour wheel in creating the shadows. So if we look at the yellow and orange on the colour wheel here, we find purples are opposite. So that's going to make a really nice shadow colour. So I'm going to come in with my magenta and add into that some phthalo blue to make a nice shadow colour. And then just to tone it down, so starting with that purple, I'll add a touch of the third colour, which is yellow, in, and that will give me a lovely shadow colour. I've gone a little bit too much with the yellow. Just bring that back. There we go. And we're just going to paint underneath our shapes. A bit more blue in there. Fiddling, Eunice, you're fiddling. There we go. Kind of a grey purple. And the sunlight's coming this way, so I'm going to come in under our ball. Come up nice, close to the edge. And bring that shadow across. So now we go from something just floating in the air to grounded. Careful not to touch my apple because it's still a little bit wet. In we come around the edge and drag it off to the side. Get that lovely shadow effect. Now usually with reflections and shadows, as you move away from the object, the shadow gets weaker. So I'm just going to mop up whilst this is still wet, my damp brush, just going in and lifting out a little bit of that colour as we move away from the object. So with our apple then, with green on the colour wheel, the opposite is red. So let's mix our green and red together. We've got our green and our red. It will give us this nice browny grey colour. Touch more blue in there of the green. Lovely neutral shadow colours. So you want to take the, in this case we use both of those colours in the apple, so it's perfect. So we're going to come under our apple, come along the edge, take it out to the side. Now another way you can do this variegated effect, kind of graduated shadow, is then to take water over here. My water's a bit dirty, and creep up on that colour so it bleeds out. The dark colour will just naturally bleed out into the area you've placed that water. So that's another really nice way to create a shadow and just let the watercolour work for you. Bring that water in, let it follow the shadow, the sunlight, the light shining on my page. I think I'm going to darken that a little bit more with some blue. I'm going to go in again, touch down into that shadow, clean my brush off, and like we did in our first exercise, just nudge in that colour where I want it to go with a damp brush. Oops, wrong colour. And it will get lighter and lighter as it comes away from the apple. Eunice the perfectionist is still not happy with how dark this shadow is, particularly on the camera. I look up at the big screen that I have in the studio to see what this looks like on another device, and it doesn't look dark enough, so I'm just going in again with a bit more purple, making that a bit darker, a little bit darker, and working that out to the edge. Now I'm happy. So guys, I really hope you enjoyed that little exercise and that you'll practice this technique. Remember, you can pop over and have a look at how I use this in the sparrows. Please, if you enjoyed the video, hit the subscribe and the bell button so that you're notified when I post another video, which will hopefully be next week. Take care, enjoy painting, and I will see you again soon. Bye for now. Bye.